Good afternoon, and thank you, Olivia, for your introduction. My name is Kim Manning. I teach political science and gender studies at Concordia University. And I would also like to acknowledge that my work, including this work on this project, takes place on unceded Indigenous lands of the Kanehagaha Nation. I'm going to just give you a quick, brief introduction to the project before I introduce our 5 speakers this afternoon. So we're going to have quite a bit of what will be hopefully a rich and interesting discussion. This project was first funded in 2017 by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and Erin DeVore was actually a collaborator on that grant application. We are a team of cross-national co-investigators and many collaborators, and we've been expanding over the last 6 years. We are now a team of 8 co-investigators and numerous community collaborators, including Wabanaki Two-Spirit, the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance, and the work of Dee and Suzanne, who you will be hearing from shortly. The team of co-investigators are cis and include one trans academic parent of trans plus children and non-binary young people. We are white or white passing, straight passing, and queer. Most recently, Jay Wallace-Skelton, who unfortunately was not able to join us today, who spent years undertaking trans advocacy and recently finished their PhD at OISE, has also joined as first a postdoc and is now a co-investigator on the project. As Jules Gill-Peterson said last night in the film that many of us watched together, Framing Agnes, the current moment whereby we are seeing young trans people emerging and into public consciousness, this is not new. However, the moment does have new characteristics to it insofar as many parents, including a number of us on the team, have struggled to try and understand and advocate for our children. The goals of this project, quite broadly, have been to develop a deeper understanding of the experience of parent advocates, broadly defined, both invisible and visible forms of advocacy on behalf of and/or with trans and non-binary children and youth in their care. So you'll be hearing from different pieces of the project today. And what I'd like to say is over the last few years, as we've been developing the project, we'd started out with an initial project, but always with the aim in mind of trying to develop sub-projects that would be able to speak to some of the diversity of work underway that does not make it into the headlines. And so, for example, we've sought to create projects with parents and families living in rural areas, with Black caretakers and caregivers, and also with Indigenous and Two-Spirit families as well, just to name a few. You'll be hearing from some of this in the next few moments. But I'd also like to say that part of the challenges with the project, of course, it in some ways comes from our positionality as both being parents and advocates and academics as well. And so some of the challenges that we've had to face have had to do with the very experiences that we've experienced as parents and caregivers. No small part of that has also been the pandemic, when we've really had to shift some of our methodologies as well. Okay, without further ado, I would like to introduce our main presenters. First of all, you'll hear from Dee Marksman-Phillpotts, who is a Black, non-binary creative and academic. They obtained a diploma in child and youth care from Humber College, their bachelor's degree in sexuality studies at York University, and is currently doing their master's in social work at York University. They have experience working in various parts of the social services sector, such as school boards, community work, disability, and the arts. Sapphire Woods has a master's in education and is a Black, trans, gender nonconforming curriculum developer and educator, working from Toronto and living in Jajaje. Sapphire curates anti-oppressive and Black affirmative education workshops and research. They also provide wellness support for individuals and nonprofit organizational teams. Sapphire is also an apprenticing herbalist, designing accessible workshops in Black and racialized youth and families in Jajagé. Daisy Jeffries is a white settler, artist, writer, and educator living in Katumkak, Newfoundland, and who holds a Master of Gender Studies from Memorial University. Jennifer Davis teaches psychology at Capilano University. She's long advocated for trans rights and is currently part of a team of researchers, this team, investigating parental advocacy for trans youth in Canada. Jennifer Dyer. Jennifer's research, Jennifer teaches at MUN, Memorial University, and their work focuses on Canadian media representation of family advocacy of gender diverse kids, queer, and trans methodologies in classic studies and feminist material cultural studies. And finally, Annie Pullen Sansfaçon, whose flight unfortunately was canceled at the last minute and couldn't join us. So I'm going to be presenting her slides. Annie holds the Canada Research Chair on Transgender Children and Their Families. She teaches at the University of Montreal and is the scientific director of the research team on trans youth and their families and the co-director of CRI IAD at the University of Montreal. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dee and Sapphire. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sapphire. My colleague Dee and I will be speaking to the methodological considerations when speaking about caregivers for Black youth and children. Right now, we are pouring libations for the folks that have come before us, have never been invited to speak on our existence, and we carry them with us all the time and continue to speak to not just their existence, but want to make them known in the ways that they were erased as well. We'd also like to shout out our other two colleagues and conspirators, Mocha Dawkins and Keegan Prempa, who couldn't be here today. And our slides will start off.
Okay, so we begin. So we want to start by saying that we already belong. We are here, we were here, we will always be here, and we will not be forgotten, we will not be replaced, and we will not be removed.
Okay, so we are the research assistants. Shout out to Dr. Julie James. That very much has brought us into this research and knew that the research guides that we'll be using to investigate what our caregivers need for our Black trans children and youth, what they'll need means that the questions cannot be neutral. And so our job has been to investigate them, rework the interview questions, and make them available to our community and continue to service them with their consent with a research guide. Who are you? Oh, and again, Sapphire, my pronouns are they and them. And that encompasses, again, all the people before me and who live inside of me right now.
Yes, and I'm Dee Marksman-Phillpotts. My pronouns are also they and them. And that brings with me my mother, her mother, her mother, and her mother, and so on and so forth. Okay. So the intersections of race and class, that was a lovely thing that we had to contend with at the beginning of this project, right? So we were given the original interview guide, which we needed to adopt towards Black folks. And we noticed that there was this overarching neutralization, this language that seemed inaccessible almost. What did that mean for us? There was a tinge of privilege that we couldn't quite suss out, and we had to work through and begin to dismantle in order to make it accessible for who we were looking to speak to, right? Also, this normalization of colonial structures, like what is advocacy? What is activism? What does that look like when you're walking outside and you walk on the sidewalk and somebody wants you to move because you're Black and you don't deserve that sidewalk? Is that inherently activism? Do you have to advocate for yourself when those things happen? How did we have to contend with those themes in order to make sure that these interview questions made sense for our caregivers?
And going to normalization of colonial constructions, when even thinking about who are our parents, some of us come from constructions that are not about the nuclear family at all. This includes caregivers outside of our biological makeups, include grandmothers, include folks that we have to stay with when our parents are immigrating. We have to consider all of those things that make up a family or a unit of care. This is mine, okay. So to what Dee was saying earlier, what is it about advocacy in the first place that is inaccessible when it came to the interview questions? So for instance, in education, a lot of our Black trans children and youth already have to face a lot of barriers that have nothing to do with their gender identities or even have the opportunity to contend with those things in the first place. So for instance, in education, a lot of our children and youth are facing things like, they're facing the labels of behavioral issues or learning disabilities and disadvantages that are not being seen as learning disabilities and advantages, going into barriers. There is no space to consider the self first, especially when the self is always infringed upon in the first place. That includes bodily autonomy, just as a child themselves, adultification, and when it comes to cisnormativity, depending on texturism, featureism, those types of things already indicate to our children and youth what they should assume their gender to be. So oftentimes it's not even about girl versus boy, it's how masculine you are, how feminine you're allowed to be, and how those things are being read on your Black body already. And that takes away from energy. That's why this slide is called erosion of energy. After all of those things, then the child and the youth might then have the opportunity to consider their gender identity. And already there are so many signifiers placed on the child's body. So what does that mean for them to move forward with those considerations?
Okay. So connecting back to the research, we had to consider the idea that Blackness and transness are two very separate things that exist in different vacuums. The idea of transness, often you don't think of a Black individual. You have a very particular type of individual you think of when you hear transness. We had to come to a collective agreement on how we wanted to come into those ideas and start to kind of dismantle those ideas of what it means to be trans and who you can be, right? These spaces are often hostile for us. We are erased from them. We are not seen, and our stories are told and taken up from folks who do not look like us, who do not live like us. We have to incorporate that into our research. We have to know who we are speaking to. We also have to acknowledge that our caregivers know us and they know of us.
And they do know of us. To what Dee is saying, transness and Blackness are not two separate things. This is not new language to us. The vocabulary of transness does not sound new. There are nuances to how we are recognized in our communities, and it is frustrating to have to contend with this. It's a barrier to our research and having to go over this again and again. Being in these academic spaces that continue to erase that we exist inside of our family units, that we are not pulled out of our family units to then find ourselves. We can find ourselves and we belong inside of transness, and our trans caregiver or our caregivers of our trans children and youth very much recognize us and call us by our names. we did have to have conversations inside of our research team around what that looks like throughout our generations. So our caregiver perspectives on our trans identities for our children and youth very much comes from a place of, we love our trans kids. They're not separate from us. And also our caregivers themselves contend with being seen as advocates or activists in their own rights as well. So we didn't want to come with the research to teach them anything. We had to remake the interview questions to reflect the fact that they do know us and we're getting information from them, not having to teach them about transness. And caregiver understandings of gender are very, very prevalent. And so we wanted to make sure that they can use their own vocabulary when talking to us about the way that they care for their trans children and youth.
Wanted to avoid paternalization. Yeah, we wanted to avoid having to feel like we had to teach them just to be in conversation with us. We wanted to have their articulations and their understandings and be able to communicate with us in a way that was cohesive, which we can disseminate, but also seeing where their thoughts come from and how they've articulated the idea of gender and fluidity and transness. Yeah. Oh, you changed it. Okay, so in terms of creating community and dispelling the monolithic ideas of Blackness, Sapphire kind of went into it, but the idea that Blackness doesn't exist in the sense that the idea of Blackness is not a monolith, right? We have all different intersections and we meet at all different spaces. We are not a community, we are communities. And we can work in tandem and we can disseminate in tandem. There's also the idea that we have to continually apply our understandings for white gaze. We are doing this work for us, by us, with us. And that understanding needs to be understood on a grander scale. That this is not an invitation to look at us, but for us to look at us.
And hence going into working together, something that we also had to consider, which is very interesting, and we had a big conversation around what is considered, who can we call on to be our caregivers, in understanding that we work inside of systems that disappear our bodies, and we're still working against cultural genocide. A lot of our Black trans children and youth are in systems, inside of the social work systems, child and youth care systems. That's where we're both coming out of and having to contend with all the time. So we did have to consider non-Black caregivers of our Black trans children and youth, which I think goes without saying, but I will say it because it's being recorded, so I wanted to go into the archives, that we always have to consider everyone outside of ourselves when thinking about protecting ourselves as well. Yep. And so the let's work together is in consider of all of those things. Inside of our communities, we do work together. And this work, I'm very, very proud to be on it, and I think I can speak for the rest of the team and Julie James in that being able to deliver this work and making sure that our caregivers know that we exist and are going to be given tools to support us across our communities is really, really important to us and a powerful piece of work. So thank you, Julie, for making it happen. And we're really, really proud to be here.
I would like to say thank you to our ancestors that came with us as they apply medicine that we need in order to have these conversations.
Thank you so much, Dee and Sapphire. And next up, I'd like to ask Daisy to present their work.
Thank you, Dee and Sapphire, for opening and for offering these beautiful libations to have space in this room. I want to open with a brief statement about my research. Is this loud enough? So I want to open with a brief statement about my research and the work that I do creatively. So my work centers around grief, love, and morality in the lives of trans women and sex workers in Dahumgug, Newfoundland, and Labrador, which are the unceded and unsurrendered ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq, Beothuk, Innu, and Inuit. And as a white settler in this work, I use research creation and counter-archival inquiry to try to question and withhold trans knowledges from the colonial historical record. And this work for me takes place in conversation with scholars like Jules Gill-Peterson, Ava Hayward, Sadia Hartman, Christina Sharp, Jin Harita Warren, Cyrus Marcus Ware, Solimar Otero, Sonia Boone, Vivian Namaste, and Rhea Rollman, among others. So I'm going to be sharing today about the in/visibility of trans and non-binary youth in Newfoundland and Labrador history, and circle around to contemporary leadership. I was invited to join this project in 2019 as a research assistant, and my work has centered around arts-based research and creative methods. So in my work, to my knowledge, this article, Sexual and Other Abnormalities in the Family of a Transsexual, written by Julius John Onig and Elaine Duggan, is the first archival evidence exploring the life of a trans person, specifically a rural trans feminine youth from Newfoundland and Labrador, and it was published in 1974 in the journal Psychiatria Clinica. Julius John Onig was a professor and chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland, beginning in 1968, before later moving on to CAMH in Toronto and working with the Gender Identity Clinic. Onig was interested in links between epilepsy and transsexualism. He was looking into the brains. He was trying to make connections between various things happening in there. And somehow this trans youth ended up at his clinic. This youth had a history of seizures, which also influenced the undertaking of a case study about their life. And pivotal to this case study was the role of this child's mother, a rural mother who was encouraged to divulge intimate family history to shape the work. And by being in conversation with this rural mother, this journal explores intimate details about 19 family members on the maternal and paternal sides of this child's family to explore, again, sexual abnormalities. So in this work, Onig tries to categorize, quote, sexual abnormalities and, quote, homosexual and transsexual tendencies in the lives of 19 family members. But through this work, there is no inclination that the youth receives the care that they desire. So I wanted to highlight a passage from this article that stays with me, specifically the last section near the bottom of the text. I'll be changing the he pronouns to they. The patient's present interests in painting, poetry, are in painting, poetry, and in hairstyling. Their ambition is to study at a school of art. They are also a writer of short stories and is an avid reader of weird books. I love that. That is, books of the supernatural. Their mother added that the patient is rather superstitious and is a fortune teller. They make their own clothing and refuse to wear store-bought men's clothing. They're interested in girls' clothing and like wearing their hair long. For me, this is the only passage in this article that gives life back to this child and opens up their world in a way that shows care for them. So I wanted to highlight that, because it stays with me as I reflect on what this means in the context of trans life in 1970s rural Newfoundland and Labrador. And this begins, the medical archive opens up possibilities for trans thinking in Newfoundland and Labrador, which needs to be complicated as well. Next, I move to a short passage from an article in the Globe and Mail published in May 1996, where the voice of a trans teenager from Newfoundland and Labrador emerges during the May 1996 murders of trans sex workers in Toronto. There's a child whose name is Vivian, who's described as Vivian. The name Vivian means alive, which I wanted to note. And Vivian says, "You can't get away with this in Newfoundland, where I went to high school," meaning trans livability is foreclosed by the cultural dynamics of rural island life. But they say Toronto is a very safe place, and at the same time, their best friend's life is taken by a murderer. Their life emerges in this context, which blew my mind as a young researcher. It was the place where I least expected the life of a rural trans child to appear. And Vivian says, "You can't get away with this in Newfoundland." I'm questioning about the role of the parents in their life and the structures of care that shape their life as a trans child. But I also think about the contemporary moment and reflect on the past. So 1996, 1997, artists and community members like Makiki were beginning to lead pride marches and to organize political drag races and performance art for youth in downtown St. John's, which makes me believe that this child probably came from a rural part of the province and didn't have access to that kind of social life. The article illustrates that amidst the difficulties of surviving as trans youth, who the journalist describes as outcasts, there are brief imaginings of gender pleasure, the love in young trans kinship and siblinghood, and the glamour and world-making of drag performance. What's most emotional for me in this work is that this youth mentions how they had planned to perform the song "One More Chance" by Madonna with their friend whose life was taken, and now they will have to perform the song alone the following weekend. This is how the article ends, with grief and love entangled, and I wish so much that this child has thrived in the world that they imagined. So I'll briefly move into contemporary leadership and the problematics in that kind of cultural knowledge. How long do I have? Okay. So I'll offer a brief moment from May 2022, last year, when high school students in Labrador City walked out in protest to support trans students being able to use washrooms reflective of their gender identity. This was a major protest among trans youth, the first that I have seen in the province, and was very touching. This happens alongside community groups in Newfoundland and Labrador, like Trans Support NL, Parents of Trans and Gender Diverse Kids NL, Quadrangle Community Center, and Peace, Love, and Pride, who continue to organize with and for trans youth. Through pool and bowling parties, through movie nights, through storytelling and art events, and through the grassroots Trans March and Picnic. These kind of gatherings center trans joy, community, and love against secrecy and silence. But visibility and mediation of these networks remains fraught as trans and non-binary youth find ways to be together outside of the cultural and institutional gaze. It remains difficult to document the interior worlds of trans children because of needs for safety and privacy. And I argue that these things don't always need to be documented because they are felt and embodied. Resistance and social change live within the lives, the bodies, and knowledges of these youth. So trusting in their power that will live on, the visibility of which is shaped by politics of race and class. The Trans March specifically, lead organizer, Mi'kmaq, Two-Spirit activist Jude Benoit, has found it very important to block the possibility of documentation, no photos, no videos allowed, of the Trans March and picnics to protect trans youth from being outed to their families. And the Trans March remains such a site of joy, right, against the fragments that we find in the archive. But it doesn't need to be documented through photos because it lives on through the body. So I hold the memories of the chorus of bodies in the Trans March, the sound of voices echoing through streets, filling quiet spaces, supportive beeps from traffic, cheers from passersby, the breathing together, and the energy as archival ephemera. And so in that way, to me, they are counter-archival. They are becoming with, and they are held inside bodies and hearts. These are two short illustrations that I've made to give presence to the Trans March and to make them playful and to register the presence of childhood in them as well. And for me, it's a way of remembering and holding on. And it brings me joy to reflect on that presence. So I think about living history, I think about these archival echoes from these two brief documents that reveal precarity and vulnerability, while also offering tiny glimpses of the beautiful interiority of the world's desires and dreams of these trans children. And I look forward to seeing how oral histories and material culture and art will be documented in the future as we remember the lives of trans and non-binary youth in ways that prioritize their safety and self-determination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daisy. Next, I'd like to ask Jennifer Davis to come up.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jennifer Davis. I have newly joined Capilano University in the Department of Psychology and in Women's and Gender Studies. Before that, I spent many years in Lethbridge, Alberta, first at the University of Lethbridge and then at Lethbridge College. Anyone familiar with Alberta will know it's not the most accepting place to be if you are not a white, cisgendered, able-bodied person. So there was a lot of work to do there, I guess to say, for advocating for trans youth. And I'm presenting a little bit of this project that Kimberley referred to at the beginning that we've been involved in, of a bunch of us across Canada for the last, 6 years? Looking at parent advocacy for trans and gender non-conforming youth. So as parents, and thank you again, Daisy, for that. That was a really moving presentation, and it reminded me of why parents do what they do, right? It is exactly for those reasons that you bring up and those issues and the experiences of those youth. This is why we all do this work. And the question is what is it that we're doing and how do we go about doing it? So this project has looked at in various ways, in various dimensions, as I hope you're getting a sense of now, as to how this work proceeds. And the part that I'm going to present is, hopefully that will is work that we did. This was a friend of mine who's a cartoonist made this cartoon for us of all of us after one of our research sessions. I convinced my fellow researchers to come out to Alberta because our politics may be terrifying, but we have some really beautiful scenery. And we spent a weekend in Kananaskis, which is right near Banff for anyone who doesn't know it, really working together doing a collaborative autoethnographic work. So this is one part of our joint research, where for us as researchers and caregivers, exploring, what does it mean to us to be in this role? And just moving forward, this had several different aspects to it. So collaborative autoethnography was new to me when I started doing this. So I'm I get to be the person to explain it. It is collaborative, it's autobiographical, and it's ethnographic. It's an approach to research and writing that seeks to describe and systematically analyze personal experiences in order to understand the broader cultural experiences. And this is a view pulling from Evans 2008, the very act of engaging with collaborative autoethnography as academics disrupts the process of fitting in, sort of this academy floating head syndrome, which anyone who's in academics knows what I mean by that, I'm sure. How people are expected to function sort of as disembodied brains, not connected to their own bodies or their families or their lives or their communities outside of that experience. So collaborative autoethnography tries to move past that and find a way of combining those elements together. The accounts of these experiences are often messy, as you might imagine, and the idea is for us to try to integrate and make meaning of these experiences in some sort of organic, dynamic way as we're going through. Okay. And that's pictures of us in Kananaskis doing some art, taking some walks in the forest. And I'll start off with just some art, because one of the themes that I have been exploring, myself and Julie James, who was mentioned earlier, is the theme of protection. So for parents of trans and gender nonconforming youth, a lot of the work that we do is really about keeping our children safe, allowing them to have the space to just be and to grow and to mature and to become the people that they are trying to become. And so the art part of this trip to Kananaskis, like we did some painting. That was me. I did some crocheting because one of the researchers didn't have a hat, so I made her a hat. Right? And this sort of embodied our initial view of protection as some sort of what we talk about, sort of like almost like a warrior version of like creating a shield around your child so other things can't get in, but also that sort of soft, comforting, sort of nurturing side of protection as well. And then another part of this piece, we went and did a photo voice project doing a walk, forest walk, during which we all took pictures of things that reminded us of the concept of protection. So I'm just going to show you a couple of those to give you the sense. So what we found again was that sort of warrior, nurturer concepts, right, of creating that shield, but also providing a warm, comforting environment really showed up within these photographs as well, right? So here you have the thorns providing protection, but underneath it, these small little plants are given space to grow. Or here you have the bark from this tree, which has been stripped off presumably by a deer, right? But the bark has been there protecting the tree. This one also captures the stress and sort of damage that parents are willing to absorb as well in the act of protecting their children, and the things that we will accept and take on ourselves so that they don't have to. And then this one, which is just a piece of a sign that we happen to pass, brings out this issue that we have these two sort of roles, but they're not fully discrete, because nothing is fully discrete. We know that, right? That a lot of our parenting work is constantly shape-shifting and moving and between these roles and sort of finding how much of which one is needed for that given moment and that given situation. Here's another one on that theme. This was taken the same spot, but in two different seasons. And you can see in one, it's sort of warm and open, and you can see clearly through the water. And in the other, it's frozen and hard and closed off. And then we looked at, why do we do this? Obviously for our children, but what is the goal for our children? And so this photo, I don't know if you can see it. You've got the tennis ball in the foreground. Imagine that's the parent. And in the water, if you look closely, you can see there's a red and white fishing lure sort of bobbing. If I can point it. There. You can see it. You could just barely see it in there. This is the goal. The goal for us as parents is to foster resilience in our children, right? To give them the space to grow, and then eventually to be able to go on and go off on their own and be successful and be supported in the world, right? This is why we do what we do. I'm going to cry now. Sorry. I didn't realize I'd get so emotional up here. And how are we able to do this? Because this, by no means is the same depth and level of work as a trans person actually has to go through, but it's still very hard work on the part of parents, and it is a constant vigilance that we take on in doing this. So how is it that we're able to sustain this and to manage this work? And we do it by having support. right? Like the trees here in the back that have fallen, but they're not completely on the ground because they've been caught by the other trees in the forest, and they're being held up. And this is what allows us to continue on and move forward and do this work, is being in groups like this and having people around us who are there to help hold our hands when we need our hands held, right? Or let us cry when we need to cry, and all of those other things. And I just want to close by bringing this back to, there's another aspect of our work that hasn't really been talked about yet, but I think you will hear a little bit more about it at the end. As another part of this project, we put together a series of social action research groups. This was pre-COVID, when you could still, get together with people for stuff. And I had the honor of running the one in Lethbridge, Alberta, and of a group of 8 parents and other caregivers who came together to really just learn how to better support their children and to support each other. And this happened, just by the way, for anybody who follows the politics, in the middle of the provincial election in which Jason Kenney was elected Premier of Alberta, which was obviously a little stressful for our parents and their children. And again, it's just some of the themes that come through. Some of that, when we ask the parents at the end, what did they benefit from having been part of this group? These are some of the things that they listed. And again, you'll see this importance of having that support, having people there to help hold you up, the strength of being together as opposed to doing this work alone, and the value of that for being able to parent their children and feel like they're doing a good job parenting their children. All right, we're out of time, and that was my last slide, so there we go. Thank you very much.
We put together a media analysis, so I'm going to give a summary of what we found there. And I'm going to read, because that's what I do. Through a discourse analysis of major Canadian print and online media coverage of transgender and gender diverse youth and families, we identified in our analysis, first, a rise in trans-affirming reporting, which was a bit of a surprise. Second, a rise in evidence-based reporting. And third, a minimal moral panic backlash. And fourth, which we'll hopefully get to at the end, a historical moment of the social movement of caregiver parent advocacy for trans kids in Canada based on the work of mothers. Our analysis is grounded in Andrea O'Reilly's description of contemporary motherhood as an autonomous social movement where mothers become activists out of necessity. And this follows Ruddick's argument that maternal practices create unique ways to reimagine peace and justice. The coverage of trans issues in Canada since 2010 has trended trans-affirming, increasing since 2015. More provocatively, our analysis found a clear overlap between the discourses introduced into the news by caregivers and mothers in news stories about or by parents of trans youth, which changed the news. It changed the news discourse from mere explanations to the discourses of human rights challenges, social policy change, trans joy, and the validity of childhood autonomy in knowing one's own gender. Our discourse analysis explored 4 key dimensions of Canadian media reporting on trans youth and their families. First, the ways an article represents trans and gender diverse youth and their families and experiences. Second, the message about childhood gender diversity. Third was the evidence supporting that message. And fourth was which model of discourse, like an op-ed or a health story, represents them. Children and youth are now a category distinct from their adult counterparts in the news, demanding different press treatment. While some trans youth independently engage in media work, most tend to rely, in our representations, upon the support of at least one parent to raise awareness about trans issues. Now, popular understandings of diverse gender identities and expressions seem to be shaped by descriptions from cisgender journalists through essentialist wrong body discourse. Now, when gender diversity is presented this way, representations of happiness, struggles, and diversity amongst gender identities and expressions is unrecognized or corralled back into the binary. Journalists may cite published research, yet do not independently confirm the facts, producing a sort of 2 sides of the story approach where positive and negative accounts are presented equivalently. And media coverage is colored white, skewing public understanding of who is and what it means to be trans or non-binary. This marginalized trans people of color initially to points of erasure. Online, cutie pot communities seem to turn instead to social media websites that inform, support, share stories, and provide training. Now, because media representations affect the challenges faced by families, our discourse analysis considers accuracy, frequency, content, and fairness. We sourced 4 pan-Canadian English language sources from 2011 to 2019, which coincided with increasing media reports about trans issues and Canada's parent advocacy movement. And these included the online CBC News, the National Post, the Globe and Mail, and Maclean's magazine. We focused online because, as I can tell you from Newfoundland, some regions don't get paper editions. Online ones have searchable histories, and on the online content is near identical to paper editions. And the keywords we used in searching these were trans youth, transgender children, trans parenting, and transgender students, mostly because anything else was way too big or narrowing these down didn't give us a whole lot of information. The discourse analysis enabled us to capture what was discussed and how, revealing an increase in affirmative, positive-toned articles about trans kids and their families, and identified gaps in reporting about IBPOC communities and intersections between specific identities. We categorize stories as trans-affirming, neutral, or trans-critical based on how the stories supported and affirmed, merely explained, or actively pathologized or disapproved of trans identities, recognizing that although some early stories used contentious terms prior to what seemed to be a watershed in trans support in 2015, the tone was still very affirming. We were aware of the positive images debate, where normative representations tend to prioritize as positive the queer identities that conform to hegemonic cis expectations. The trans-affirming stories we identified instead affirmed gender diverse children and youth by, for example, recognizing their own forms of joy, reporting support for and by families in various ways, promoting medical and legal trans awareness, science-based understandings of trans health, challenging human rights limitations, and reporting why, generally speaking this is the biggest, why parents fight to accommodate trans youth in schools and sports. Neutral stories are the two sides of the story approach, and negative stories tend to criticize or pathologize families and trans kids by the usual suspects writing op-eds. No names. Our analysis showed us first how news media represent trans issues that pertain to youth and their parent advocates, and in doing so provided, secondly, a concomitant recognition of the social movement history of parent advocacy. And this led us to newly consider parent advocacy of trans youth as an emergent form of social activism particular to Canada, though not unrelated to US activism. So we surveyed 148 media stories using our keywords. We did not analyze their reach, only the coverage and representation, because there's just too much. And we did not explore any other trans identities in families, just focusing on the kids. Considering the role of parents, our analysis determined which stories were parent-led, and this seemed to coincide with the historical moments in 2015. There's so many things happening in 2015. The introduction of Ontario's Bill 77, the lead up to the passage of Bill C-16, for example. Overall, I'm trying to summarize really quick. Thank you. The reporting on trans and gender diverse youth in Canada trended neutral and affirming. The majority of neutral stories are informational. The majority of the critical news articles are op-eds. But generally speaking, the stories by or about caregivers and mothers are the ones that are most visible here. There's little news media evidence of families publicly supporting their gender diverse kids prior to 2011, to the 2011 push for sociocultural policy or human rights changes. But by 2014, parents and kids began going public and joining with other families nationally to challenge policies that deter trans acceptance. By 2017, media reports revealed parents were assuming positions of community leadership, and by 2018, parents were writing the news stories. I think it's important to talk about in my 30 seconds that I might have left. Where was I? Who is left? We found representations of advocacy work to be multifaceted and laborious, presenting a new normal of mundane advocacy. But the analysis showed that only parents with class and race-based privilege are even encouraged to come forward, marking a need for further race-based media analysis. So ideally, this would be a next step here. Revealing the centrality of urban whiteness evinced in this media narrative prompted for us a process of self-reflection. White and white-passing mothers and their advocacy erases or can erase the identities of parents and caregivers racialized not white. And for this reason, trans activism must take on a decolonial approach, challenging the binary legacy of settler colonialism. I think I'll end it there.
Thanks, everyone. Again, my name is Kim Manning, and I'm speaking on behalf of Annie Pullen Sansfaçon today, who unfortunately could not join us. I mentioned earlier that our project has been through many ups and downs over the years, many challenges. One of the most difficult for Annie in particular was the passing of her research assistant who worked with her on this project. And so I'd like to, on behalf of Annie, just say that this work is in memory of Dominique Pinot, who worked on this project. So very quickly, this work was also a self-directed group work with parents originally in the Gaspésie, using a similar methodology that Jennifer Davis had used in Alberta. This emerges out of research that Annie had originally undertaken in 2011 in Montreal, the self-directed group work which led to the formation of Gender Creative Kids Canada in 2012. Very little research to date on the experiences of rural families who are raising transgender, non-binary children. And so this work was an attempt to begin to address that. The project took place in Quebec, and you can see nearly 2 million people live in the region, and it ended up being a two-pronged project, again, in part because of the limitations of the pandemic. So there was a social action research group that took place, and that was then followed up with additional interviews with parents living in the province of Quebec. In a wider rural territory. So research questions: what are the issues experienced by parents with regard to supporting their transgender youth in rural settings? And how does advocacy take shape for parents in rural areas? I'm not going to go into a lot about the self-directed group work itself, but just to say that it was very difficult to do the self-directed group work in week after week. There were only 5 meetings that had participants, and some of the challenges included snowstorms and road closures, low density of population, a large area, and fear of confidentiality among participants. And the data at this stage was recorded on open handwritten notes that were then typed. Thank you. For the self-directed group work, a total of 7 women and 2 men took part in 1 or more of the 5 meetings. You know, again, that many of the experiences that have been discussed in other writings about parents were also discussed in this setting as well, and that is, and then there was also some additional, and that is feelings of exacerbation of stigma in particular, and proximity, for example, to people in the community, limited access to resources, and if issues of confidentiality in particular were challenging. The interviews, as you saw, were a wider area, and I believe that they were an additional of 9 parents that took part. Yes, including 2 people forming a couple, so, and there are additional information about the parents here, but again, for lack of time, I'm going to just. I think that one of the things that I really want to emphasize is that However, despite the challenges, including questions of confidentiality, one of the examples that Annie provided me was, for example, for one family, the only gender-affirming psychologist in town was good friends with the family, right? So that makes it very difficult to access care in that context. It's also very hard to get access to, or it's more challenging to get access to medical resources when you're outside of large urban centers. Increased cost of travel, parent isolation, et cetera. However, I think that what's really one of the really important findings of Annie and her team here was that whereas in contrast to what they call metronormative narratives that portray rural areas as hostile places potentially for gender transition, that actually a number of parents discussed quite positive experiences for their families, and that families living in smaller communities did experience support that maybe is not as prevalent in more urban settings than they were experiencing in these regional areas. And this really opens up, I mean, these are small studies, both the self-directed group work and the interviews themselves, but I think it does really emphasize the need for a lot more research, which takes very seriously the needs of parents and families living in rural areas and how to better service those families as we continue to move forward. And I know that there are lots of folks working across the country, including here in British Columbia, trying to work and wrestle through those challenges as well. But just to say that there are a lot of advantages as well to those families that I think many of us can learn from as well. So I'm going to keep it very brief and short. Again, this is work that's undertaken by Annie Pullen Sansfaçon, and if you're interested in learning more, she's got published papers, I think one of which is in French, but to please do contact her, and I know that she'd be happy to answer questions. And from there, I would like to thank all of our presenters, and I would like to reserve a few minutes for questions that I will ask if you wouldn't mind leading. Thank you.